Chosen one, listen carefully. This message isn't an accident. God is preparing something you never saw coming. There are moments in life when losing someone feels like losing everything. You prayed for the relationship, you imagined the future, you invested your emotions, your time, your trust, and perhaps even your faith into the possibility that this person was meant to stay. So when the relationship begins to fall apart, your first instinct may be to ask, God, why are you taking him away from me? But what if the better question is, God, what are you saving me from? That question changes everything. Because sometimes God removes someone before you understand why they had to go, and that is one of the most difficult forms of faith. It is easy to trust God when he gives you what you want. It is much harder to trust him when he takes away what you were convinced you needed. Think about how human attachment works. When you become emotionally connected to someone, your mind doesn't simply remember the person. It begins building a future around them. You imagine conversations that haven't happened, milestones you haven't reached, a home you haven't lived in, and a life that exists mostly in your imagination. Eventually, you are no longer grieving only the person. You are grieving an entire future you created around that person, and that is why separation can feel unbearable. But your emotions are not always evidence of God's intention. You can deeply miss someone who was not good for you. You can love someone who is incapable of loving you properly. You can feel a powerful connection with someone whose presence would eventually destroy the peace you spent years building. This is where discernment becomes more important than desire. We often ask God to give us what we want, but rarely ask him to remove what would eventually harm us. We say, God, bless this relationship, while forgetting to say, God, if this relationship is not for me, give me the courage to release it. That second prayer requires maturity, because sometimes the answer to your prayer does not arrive as a person coming closer. Sometimes it arrives as someone walking away. Sometimes the door closes. Sometimes the messages stop. Sometimes the relationship suddenly becomes impossible, and you interpret all of it as rejection when God may be using the very thing that breaks your heart to redirect your life. You have to understand something about divine protection. It does not always feel like protection while you are experiencing it. A child may cry when a parent prevents them from touching something dangerous. The child doesn't understand the danger. All they understand is that something they wanted was taken away. We can be like that spiritually. We see the person. God sees the pattern. We see the chemistry. God sees the character. We see what he promised. God sees what he repeatedly does. We see today. God sees where today's decisions could take us 5 years from now. And perhaps that is why certain relationships become uncomfortable before they become impossible. Perhaps the constant confusion is not something you are supposed to solve. Perhaps it is something you are supposed to recognize. You don't have to call every painful ending a miracle. You don't have to pretend that heartbreak doesn't hurt. Faith does not require you to deny your emotions. It requires you to refuse to let your emotions become your only source of truth. There may come a moment when you finally realize that the person you begged God to keep was the very person God was trying to free you from. And when that realization comes, you may look back at the tears, the unanswered messages, the closed doors, and the painful distance differently. You may realize that God wasn't punishing you. He was protecting you. So if someone is leaving your life right now, don't rush to chase what God may be asking you to release. Pause, pray, observe. Look beyond what you feel today and ask what this relationship was producing in you. Was it peace or constant anxiety? Was it growth or emotional exhaustion? Was it truth or endless confusion? Was it bringing you closer to who you were created to become, or slowly making you abandon yourself? Because sometimes the greatest blessing is not the person God sends into your life. Sometimes it is the person he gives you the strength to let go. What breaks your heart today may be the very thing that saves your future. And this is where the story becomes even more uncomfortable, because sometimes the person you keep defending is the very person God is trying to expose. You have to understand what attachment does to the human mind. When we become emotionally invested in someone, we rarely evaluate them objectively. We begin protecting the relationship from the truth. We explain away the things that should concern us. We turn red flags into excuses. We call inconsistency confusion. We call disrespect a bad day. We call emotional distance, he just needs time. And slowly, without realizing it, we begin defending a person against evidence that is right in front of us. Why? Because accepting the truth would require us to make a difficult decision. It would require us to let go. And sometimes letting go hurts more than believing the lie. You may have seen the pattern before. He says something beautiful and you forget what he did yesterday. He promises to change and you ignore how many times the same promise has been made. He gives you attention after hurting you, and suddenly you interpret that attention as proof that he cares. But attention is not always love. Words are not always commitment. And potential is not the same thing as character. This is one of the greatest psychological traps in relationships. Falling in love with who someone could become rather than honestly accepting who they consistently are. You don't fall in love only with a person. Sometimes you fall in love with a possibility. You see his potential. You imagine the healed version of him. You imagine the mature version of him. You imagine the man he might become if he finally understands your worth, if he finally changes, if he finally becomes serious, and because you can see that future so clearly, you start confusing imagination with reality. But God does not ask you to build your life around someone's potential. He asks you to pay attention to fruit. Character reveals itself through patterns. Anyone can apologize, anyone can make a promise, anyone can say, "I'm different now." But transformation is demonstrated through consistent behavior. This is why sometimes God allows a person's behavior to become increasingly obvious, not because he wants to hurt you, but because he wants to remove your ability to keep deceiving yourself. Think about that. Perhaps the reason the situation keeps becoming clearer is because you keep asking God for clarity, and clarity does not always arrive as a supernatural sign. Sometimes clarity arrives as repetition. The same disrespect, the same dishonesty, the same emotional manipulation, the same disappearing and returning, the same promises followed by the same behavior. At some point, you have to stop asking, "What does he mean?" and start asking, "What does his pattern mean?" That question can change your life, because mature love does not require you to become a detective. You should not have to constantly investigate someone's intentions, decode their messages, or analyze their silence to determine whether you matter. Healthy relationships may have difficult seasons, but they should not consistently force you to abandon your dignity just to maintain the connection. And this is where spiritual discernment becomes powerful. Sometimes God exposes a person not by revealing some dramatic secret, but by allowing their character to become impossible for you to ignore. You may have prayed, "God, show me the truth." And then the truth begins appearing. You may not like it. You may argue with it. You may cry over it. You may even try to negotiate with it. But truth does not become less true because you are emotionally attached to the person involved. There comes a moment when you have to choose between the person you wish he were and the person he has consistently shown himself to be. That choice may break your heart, but it can also restore your life, because God is not interested in preserving every relationship you desperately want. He is interested in preserving the person you are becoming. So stop asking only, "Does he love me?" Ask the deeper questions. Does this relationship produce peace? Does it produce honesty? Does it encourage growth? Does it strengthen your character? Does it bring you closer to God, or does it constantly pull you away from yourself? Because sometimes the greatest act of faith is not holding on tighter. It is finally accepting what God has been showing you. When God exposes the truth, don't defend what he is trying to deliver you from. And once you begin to see the truth, something else happens that can be even more painful. His name begins to carry a weight that you cannot easily explain. You hear it, and suddenly memories return. A conversation, a place, a promise, a moment when you genuinely believed that this person was going to be part of your future. The name itself becomes connected to everything you hoped would happen, and that is why some names can break you. Not because the name has power over you, but because of what you attach to it. A name can become a container for an entire emotional story. When you hear it, you don't simply hear a word. Your mind retrieves the moments associated with it. You remember the way he looked at you, the things he said, the future you imagined, the nights you waited, the questions you never received answers to. Psychologically, this is why letting go can feel so complicated. You are not simply separating from a person. You are separating from an identity, a routine, a hope, and sometimes an imagined future. You may have spent months or years telling yourself, "This is the person." And when that belief begins to collapse, it can feel as though part of your own identity is collapsing with it. But here is the truth you have to understand. Sometimes what needs to be broken is not your heart, but your attachment to an illusion. You may have loved him sincerely. That does not mean your interpretation of the relationship was correct. You may have felt something powerful. That does not automatically mean it was divine. You may have prayed for him. That does not mean God promised him to you. And this distinction matters because faith can sometimes become confused with wishful thinking. We can convince ourselves that because we desperately want something, God must want it for us too. But surrender begins when you can say, "God, I wanted this, I loved this, I imagined this. But if it is not your will, I am willing to release it." That is a powerful prayer, because you are no longer trying to convince God to give you what you want. You are asking God to transform what you want until it becomes aligned with what is good for you. And perhaps that is why his name hurts so much right now. It represents the future you thought you were going to have. It represents the version of yourself that believed everything would eventually work out. It represents unanswered questions. But you cannot build your future by constantly revisiting your past. At some point, you have to stop asking why he did what he did and start asking what this experience is teaching you. Maybe it is teaching you boundaries. Maybe it is teaching you patience. Maybe it is teaching you that love without respect is not enough. Maybe it is teaching you that chemistry without character is dangerous. Maybe it is teaching you that you can miss someone without needing to return to them. That last lesson is important. Missing someone does not mean you made the wrong decision. Feeling lonely does not mean you should reopen a closed door. Remembering the good moments does not erase the reasons the relationship ended. Your emotions can remember what your wisdom has already outgrown, and healing begins when you stop treating every memory as an instruction. You can remember him without returning to him. You can forgive him without giving him access to you. You can love what was good without pretending what was harmful never happened. And eventually, the name that once broke you may become simply a name, not a command, not a temptation, not a prophecy, just a reminder of a chapter that ended. And perhaps one day you will understand why God allowed that chapter to close. You will realize that he was not asking you to forget the past. He was asking you to stop living inside it. Because sometimes God has to break your attachment to a person before he can fully introduce you to the person you are becoming. Let the name hurt if it must, but never let it decide your future. And once you begin to release the emotional attachment, you may finally be ready to confront one of the hardest possibilities. Perhaps God was not simply saving you from the person himself. Perhaps he was saving you from the future you would have created with him. Because we tend to judge relationships by how they feel in the present. We look at attraction, chemistry, affection, memories, and the moments when everything seems beautiful. But life is not built from moments alone. It is built from patterns, and the person you choose today can influence the person you become tomorrow. That is why the wrong relationship can become more dangerous than the wrong decision. A decision can cost you a day. A relationship can shape your years. It can influence your confidence, your priorities, your friendships, your emotional stability, your finances, your family, your faith, and even the way you see yourself. This is why sometimes God allows you to experience disappointment before he allows you to experience understanding. You may be crying because the relationship ended, while God may be protecting you from the consequences of it continuing. Think about that for a moment. What if the relationship had continued? What if you had married him? What if the promises had convinced you to ignore the warning signs? What if the behavior that bothered you while dating became the behavior you had to live with every day? What if the emotional instability became your normal? What if the disrespect you tolerated in small moments eventually became a pattern that shaped your entire household? You cannot always see the consequences of a relationship while you are standing inside it. That is why perspective matters. When you are emotionally attached, you tend to evaluate the person based on what they make you feel today. But wisdom asks a different question. Who will I become if I stay connected to this? That question can expose what emotion tries to hide, because the right person should not require you to become smaller so they can remain comfortable. The right relationship should not demand that you abandon your values just to keep someone close. It should not consistently drain your peace, weaken your confidence, or make you question your worth. And no, that does not mean a healthy relationship will never have conflict. It will. Two imperfect people will disagree. There will be misunderstandings, difficult seasons, and moments of weakness. But there is a difference between imperfect love and destructive patterns. One produces growth, the other produces erosion. And sometimes God lets you experience the difference. Perhaps you thought you were losing your future when He walked away. Maybe you were actually being given your future back. Because there are people who can become so central to your emotional world that you begin organizing your entire life around keeping them. You stop asking what you want. You stop asking what you believe. You stop asking where you are going. You only ask, how do I keep him? But a relationship that requires you to lose yourself in order to preserve it is already costing you too much. God's protection may therefore look like a closed door. It may look like an unanswered prayer. It may look like an opportunity that disappeared. It may even look like someone choosing not to choose you. And yes, that can hurt deeply. But pain is not always proof that something was wrong. Sometimes pain is the price of transition. The old life is ending, and the new one has not yet become visible. That space between them can feel empty. But empty does not mean meaningless. It can be preparation. It can be recovery. It can be the place where your identity is rebuilt without the person you once depended upon. So before you beg God to restore someone, ask Him to reveal what restoration would actually mean. Would bringing him back restore your peace or restore your anxiety? Would it strengthen your purpose or distract you from it? Would it help you become more of who you were created to be or force you back into a version of yourself you have already outgrown? You may not understand the closed door today, but one day you may stand on the other side of it and realize that the future you were mourning was not the future God intended for you. And when that day comes, you will understand something powerful. God did not take your future away. He protected you from the wrong future so you could finally walk toward the right one. And after the relationship breaks, after the truth becomes impossible to ignore, and after you finally begin to understand why God allowed that door to close, there is another transformation that must take place. You have to allow the breaking to teach you, because heartbreak can either make you bitter or make you discerning. It can convince you that nobody can be trusted, or it can teach you how to recognize who deserves your trust. It can make you build walls around your heart, or it can teach you how to build boundaries around your life. There is a difference. A wall says, nobody gets in. A boundary says, not everyone gets access. That distinction can change everything. Sometimes we think healing means forgetting the person, but real healing is deeper than forgetting. Healing means remembering without being controlled by the memory. It means you can think about what happened without allowing it to determine what happens next. And this is where the psychological side of heartbreak becomes important. When someone repeatedly disappoints you, your mind can begin creating a story about yourself. You may start thinking, maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I'm difficult to love. Maybe if I had been more patient, more attractive, more understanding, or more forgiving, he would have stayed. But you have to challenge that story. Someone's inability to love you properly is not proof of your lack of worth. Their inconsistency is not a measurement of your value. Their rejection is not God's verdict on your identity. Sometimes the lesson is not, become better so they will choose you. Sometimes the lesson is, become wiser so you stop choosing what repeatedly wounds you. That is a completely different kind of growth. You begin asking better questions. Not, how can I make him love me? But, why was I willing to accept so little? Not, what can I do to make this relationship work? But, what is this relationship doing to the person I am becoming? Not, why doesn't he see my value? But, why am I giving someone else the authority to define it? Those questions create strength, and perhaps this is one of the reasons God allowed the experience, not because he wanted you broken, but because he wanted you awake. Pain has a strange ability to expose what comfort hides. It reveals where you were dependent. It reveals where you ignored your intuition. It reveals where you confused attention with affection. It reveals where you sacrificed your peace for temporary connection. And if you are courageous enough to learn from those revelations, the heartbreak becomes more than an ending. It becomes education. You begin to recognize patterns earlier. You stop being impressed by words without action. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop thinking that emotional chaos is evidence of passion. You stop chasing people who only become interested when you begin walking away. You begin to understand that consistency is attractive, character is attractive, honesty is attractive, peace is attractive. And suddenly, the things that once seemed boring begin to feel beautiful because your nervous system is no longer addicted to uncertainty. That is real transformation. You don't become cold, you become clear. You don't stop loving. You learn to love without abandoning yourself. You don't lose your softness, you gain discernment. And perhaps that is what God is building inside you now. A person who can love deeply without becoming emotionally enslaved. A person who can forgive without reopening every door. A person who can recognize potential without confusing it with character. A person who can walk away without needing revenge. A person who can say, I loved you, but I will not lose myself trying to keep you. That is not bitterness, that is maturity. So don't waste the pain. Don't allow the heartbreak to become nothing more than a sad chapter you wish you could erase. Ask yourself what it came to teach you. Ask what boundary you should have had. Ask what warning you ignored. Ask what part of yourself you abandoned while trying to preserve the relationship. Then reclaim it, because the goal is not simply to survive what happened. The goal is to become wiser because it happened. And one day, you may look back at the person who broke your heart and realize that he did not destroy you. He introduced you to a version of yourself you had never met before. Let the pain become wisdom, and let the wisdom become the life you were meant to live.